is.
So, Catherine, welcome. On that positive note, this is our 2020 gloom and doom discussion.
Woohoo! Always good to have a little gloom and doom.
Well, that's how we're going to close out the year. We're going to put it all into one big shit pile. We're going to set it on fire. These recordings will still be available afterward, but we're gonna have a more positive 2021.
Agreed. Absolutely.
But on that note, what's your prediction for what you think is going to be a new trend in 2021 on the threat side?
I don't truly believe we're going to see anything new per se. I mean, everything old is new again, right? So even with what we've recently seen, most recently with FireEye and SolarWinds, certainly that was not a good thing, right? There was a whole lot of devastation to an awful lot of companies and entities, but at the heart of what was done wasn't super new. I mean, we've known that that was a possibility. So I don't know that we're going to see anything truly new. What I expect is we will see things that are old done in slightly different ways that make them come across new enough that the media decides to jump on it and run with it. That's my prediction, because that's kind of what we've seen, right? When people talk about all of this stuff, and they say to me, oh, you've been in security for how long, and I don't know how you stay on top of it all. I'm like, because the change is not radical. It's the same problems we've been encountering for a very long time. And while it's cool because this stuff does evolve to a certain degree and there's always new stuff to learn, the heart of what we've seen has not changed.
Yeah, that sophistication is not as sophisticated as it is portrayed.
No, but I am grateful that at least when they used the word sophistication with the SolarWinds thing, and they used APT, they were actually not just talking about a business email compromise. So, yay for using the right words, because I've certainly seen plenty of that. Yeah.
It's easy to attribute that. No, I was just going to say it's easy to attribute that and kind of play off your negligence or your breach. If you call it APT, if it was sophisticated, you're not really liable, so it's no big deal, right? Like that kind of play off blame game. I get from a liability standpoint and a business standpoint, like as a businessman, like, yeah, I would love to have someone to blame that on, but we really have to kind of start to get away from that as the professional industry that we are. We'll leave that to the cyber insurance companies and let them, play off their liability however they want. But
yeah, and I think one thing we will start to see, and we're already seeing, right, are those insurance companies going, no, I'm not going to pay for this anymore. No, we're going to change the contract. So when you get hit with this thing we already know about, you're out of luck. So.
Yeah, cyber insurance is going to be a dangerous game to play. And again, we're going to end up with more lawyers because they're going to have to read through all of that fine print, and we'll be doing some circular investing, we'll call
it. Agreed.
I like how we brought in the third rail of cyber insurance here, because that's its own separate problem. Anyone got a solution on that one?
Ooh.
And that ties into the ransomware issue, because ransomware has been ravishing the down market, right? I break the world into three categories. We have the haves, which we spend most of our time talking about have problems, right? When we're talking about, like, you talk about UEFI, I mean, you're talking about the top of the littlest percentage that can even consider a problem like that, let alone understand what it is. And then you have this other really small group that's just below those haves, and then everybody else is a have-not. And those have-nots are municipalities, local communities, water treatment plants, small to medium-sized businesses, and they're the ones that are getting torched by ransomware. And my prediction from several years ago on what was going to happen with ransomware was, I considered it the collateral impact of connectivity, which was no one's going to target a community bank, right? There's nobody sitting there going like, well, I really want to go hit Peoria because there's so much money there. But Peoria happens to use a lot of the same systems because as much as we have all these different vendors, there's still fundamentally a significant monoculture and everything's connected, right? That's what the internet does. And so what happens is, insert large financial bank can protect itself, and that ransomware that's going after them just happens to sort of slide off and knock that community bank offline.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
agree. I would absolutely agree. And I think too, I mean, so I'm in higher ed, and that's another space that has been hit pretty hard. And what we see with some of this stuff, it's really common that the attacker puts something out right through email, and once it's downloaded and they get to the next stage, what they're doing at that next stage is looking around and saying, hey, where did I land? Is this an interesting place? Should I keep going? So the true targeting nature of some of this stuff is that it isn't. It's just, what can I get into? And when I get to that next stage, woohoo, look at that, I'm in a thing, and it might be cool, and there might be useful data here. So
yeah, that target of opportunity and target landscape, really you're getting to the point where at the end of the day, criminal enterprises, even APT groups, are still business entities. They still have deadlines, they still have timelines, they still have budgets, they have objectives and goals that they're trying to meet. And so while they're putting time into the development of, whatever it is, ransomware C2, that target of opportunity then has to become monetized in order to keep the lights on, pay the bills. Maybe they're contractors, maybe they're selling off access to APT groups. So that continual need to provide money and sustainability, at the end of the day, that we're all capitalists, even the criminals are capitalists. That capitalism has to pay for itself, and that is where we come down to that target of opportunity, or what can we get for what we've done.
agreed.
Which sets us up really well for breaking the bad news, which is your talk.
That it does.
Oh, I got to make you presenter.
You do.
I got carried
And I
away. I
will,
was having so
and
much
I will
fun.
gladly share it.
There you go. Boom.
All right. All right. Should be able to see it now, I hope. With our little grim fellow in the corner.
I liked the candy scythe.
I did too, which is why I sort of cropped him out of the other image, because I couldn't cleanly get him otherwise. But yeah, so we'll talk a little bit here about things like ransomware and breaking the bad news in the industry, because certainly, as we just discussed, this is a huge topic. So here we go. This is the agenda. This is going to be a very short version of a presentation that I typically spend a little more time on, but I think we can really hit the highlights and the really important stuff and spend most of our time there. So I'll talk briefly about myself and why this is important if you haven't already figured that out. And then we'll talk about some strengths and weaknesses that we see within InfoSec that ultimately play a role in all of us being able to communicate this information. And we'll talk about communicating at different levels within an organization. And then we'll talk a little bit about non-verbal communication, which is equally as important, and some final thoughts. So this is me. Well, not really. This is my sloth, Minnie, that I used to, was an adopted sloth at the zoo locally. She unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but I love sloths. This is really more about me. I've been with the University at Buffalo for more than 20 years. I'm on staff with some things. I do a bunch of volunteering and talks, and I have some degrees and some certifications and other assorted stuff. So what's the motivation behind this? Well, if you weren't just hearing us talk a moment ago, ransomware and other forms of attacks are pretty common. So, the odds of getting hit with something like that are pretty good. Even when we've seen perhaps in some cases a decrease in breach, we've seen an increase in records. So these are the statistics going through September of this year, because that information is basically quarterly. So this shows you literally what the odds are. And if that really isn't enough, realize that last year alone, and of course we're just coming to the end of this year, so I can't wait to see what these numbers show us, but last year we lost roughly 1 billion records, and a huge chunk of them, they may have been not PII, right? They're not sensitive data, but you could wind up with additional exposure. So this really is something that you're likely to run into. And the reason why that this talk came about is that I recognized we seem to spend a lot of time talking about ideally how to prevent bad things from happening. And we talk about how to clean up after bad things do happen, but we don't talk about communicating while those bad things are going on. So that's really the focus here today. And if you haven't seen this quote, I'd be very surprised. This idea that there's, only a couple of types of company, the ones that have been compromised in some way, and the ones that are going to be again, right? If you don't know that you've been compromised, you probably haven't looked hard enough. So sorry for the bad news. But now let's talk about our strengths and weaknesses. Really, this problem that we run into, and by this problem, I mean sort of the larger problem of compromise and the possibility of needing to do IR, is not a technology problem. It really isn't. A lot of this is a people problem. And so if you think it is, maybe you should take a step back and realize that all the technology in the world can be incredibly helpful and it has a role, but people play a huge role as well. And that's the kind of the point of this particular quote. So what are we really good at in security and in IT in general? Well, we're great at fixing things. There's a problem, we get hyper-focused and we want to solve the problem, right? So that's what we do. And we are spectacular at that. That's what we are known for. What we're not always good at and what we're known for not doing well is communicating with people. So whether or not you recognize this particular image is from a skit on Saturday Night Live where they have this computer guy who, kind of behaves like a jerk. And this is the attitude he gives, right? It's the computer that's stupid, not you, right? And we do this, and we don't necessarily do it with bad intention. We're not trying to be jerks. In most cases, but the reality is that we are, in some cases, not so nice. And it's very easy to get caught up in focusing on fixing the thing and not the bigger picture with the people. We don't have patience. Patience is tough, and I've been there, and I've been in situations where you just want to scream and tear your hair out, right? Because the person you're talking to, the people, they just don't get it, or they're not listening, or they don't understand. But realize that that goes both ways. When you get frustrated and you lose your patience, you're not patient with them either. And we'll talk about why that matters. Why does it matter? Well, there can be a loss of trust, and that's really important. If your goal ultimately, once you're done dealing with this incident, or even during the incident, is for folks to trust you to do the right kinds of things, you need to make sure that you're communicating with them in a way that continues that level of trust. You're going to have difficulty communicating with them in the future. You could have additional conflicts. There certainly could be negative impact on the reputation of the company. People go out and they talk about things they probably shouldn't. You have a decrease in morale, and everybody's stress level goes up. So we're going to use an example here of ransomware because it's so prevalent, but realistically, everything I'm talking about today, first of all, it doesn't matter exactly what role you are. So if you are, the IT person and you do everything from security to, replacing keyboards, or you are one of, a small security team or a large security team, this should apply to you when you run into some situation that you're doing some form of incident response. So the example I'm using here is ransomware. So let's imagine that you've had ransomware, but it could be SolarWinds. It could be any one of these things that, now you have to deal with. And none of them are fun, right? None of us want to go in and deal with this kind of thing. So now what do we do? Well, we can step back and go, wow, big explosion, and walk away. Not usually helpful. We can panic and completely freak out. Also not terribly helpful. So instead, we're going to have to communicate something about what is going on. And again, depending on your role, you're going to communicate with different people at different levels. So that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about. So we need to do what's called framing the conversation. And the whole idea behind framing the conversation is focusing on what's important to your audience. So these are the three levels we're going to focus on: your end user, your mid-management, and your executive. And you want to think in advance about what are the kinds of things they might ask and what is important to them. You also want to think about how you're going to get this message to them, the channel, right? So Is the message going to be sent through an internal website? Are you going to do a presentation to somebody? Is this an email, or is it in person? There's always, of course, lawyer-approved pigeon carriers, but consider your channel, because if you have an entity that is potentially inside your organization, like in the case of the SolarWinds, maybe internal email or communications of that nature is not your best option. So first, we'll talk about the end user. Usually they're focused on what impact it's going to have on their day-to-day job, right? You want to make sure that they know what happened and why, but only what they really need to know. If it's something where it's, you know, somebody's clicked on something and you have the opportunity to teach them something about what happened and encourage a change in behavior, by all means use that. Ultimately, we'll see all of these different groups, whether it's end user, mid-management, or your executive. You need to use effective and efficient communication. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, number one, be concise. Less is more, absolutely. You don't need to tell them a huge story. You need to tell them something simple. But don't use things like blaming management to tell your story, and leave out stuff that's going to be irrelevant to them. That's why it's important to focus on what is important to them. And be patient. Even if you have to go in the closet afterwards, scream, tear your hair out, it's important. Make sure that whatever you are saying, however you're communicating, that it's at a level where these folks can understand and relate to it. Because again, there are ramifications if you don't. This is how we don't want to communicate with end users, right? We don't want to scream at them. We don't want to freak them out. We don't want to give them, you know, additional fear. That's not ideal. So be upfront. Lying to them, you know, the lies we tell children, right? We tell them things to make it easier on ourselves. That often winds up biting us in the butt, and we don't want to deal with that. We want to address their fears. So if they're concerned about something, you know, be honest about what you know and what you can tell them. And perception really is reality in all cases, but especially for your end user. If they see or come across something that they have a concern about, even if you know, it's really nothing, make sure you take a moment and you listen to what they're saying. Because number one, it could be something bigger than you realize. And number two, they will really appreciate that you took that time to really listen to them. All right, our mid-level managers, right? Mid-management is a really tough place to be. Everybody who's in mid-management typically wants to go up, right? They want to be executives, and the people who are below them want to be in mid-management. That's a tough, tough place to be. They're focused on, you know, their impact to whatever business process they're involved with. So it's going to depend on their department. And again, you want to speak to them at a level that they understand. We're going to use effective and efficient communication. We're not going to use technical terms with folks who aren't in IT. And even with those who are in IT, be careful what terms you're using, because they may or may not understand them. There are groups of people in IT who might understand security terminology that other folks in IT don't. So just be aware of that. We don't want to be chickens with our heads cut off, right? We don't want to walk in there and be like, oh no, it's the end of the world, the sky is falling. We need to come to them with a plan, which we'll talk about in a second. So the ideal mid-level manager, what do they look like? Well, they've got fantastic delegation skills. Their interpersonal skills are amazing. They can communicate, they can negotiate, they have emotional intelligence, they're influencers. And where are these amazing people? Well, I've given this talk a few times, and I've actually had people come back to me and say, oh, I have an amazing manager. And that is fantastic, because, you know, we should have more of them, but they are somewhat rare, kind of like pink fluffy unicorns dancing on rainbows. So we're going to communicate with regular middle management by being supportive. Again, they're in that weird mid space, right? So you're going to come with an action plan, even if you're only presenting maybe a portion of it because of your particular job responsibilities. That action plan should include communications that go up and down. So you're going to have to, in some way, either working with them directly or yourself, communicate above them and below them, and be empathetic. Put yourself in their shoes. It is a tough, tough place to be. And whatever you do, make them look good. It can only help you in the end. So the plan we're talking about, this is what it really should include. What happened? All of your stakeholders. You should have a sense of all of these different stakeholders. So, you know, are there just internal stakeholders? Probably not. They're probably external as well in some capacity. What are the potential recovery timeframes? What are our options? You know, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again, or what can we do to at least limit that possibility, and have an end goal in mind, you know? And maybe you have a plan and it's a short-term plan, and then you have another short-term plan. So the end goal might not be get to the end and clean up and be done with everything. The end goal might be, all right, we need to get through the next 24 hours, and where do you want to be in that next 24 hours, or when do you want to be at a certain point? Be accountable. Management really needs to take responsibility for their users, which doesn't mean that we play the blame game. It just means if you are dealing with folks who've made mistakes or have done something that have caused problems, you need to take responsibility for that. So these are some things that you should be thinking about in advance, that you want to talk about with these mid-level managers, and you want to have decisions made well before this sort of thing happens, like how to handle, you know, potential ransom payments. So don't be asking the question when that happens. Ask, what are you going to do before it happens? You want to maybe you know, have that conversation with legal and anyone else that needs to be involved. You want to coach and encourage collaboration. So where in this process are you going to manage or delegate? Are you going to delegate or negotiate? Again, important things to consider. All right, so let's talk about our upper tier, our executives, right? Our executives look at the big picture. These are the things they're focused on. They're focused on the goal, the reputation of the company, and the vision and performance. You need to think 30 seconds in an elevator. So you walk into the elevator, that's all you have time to tell whatever you're going to tell them. So that means you have to do your homework. You need to understand who these people are, because remember, we're framing the questions, we're framing this, whatever we're telling them, on them. You want to enter and exit gracefully. Don't be upset. Don't, as best you can, you don't want to be agitated. You're going to discuss things strategically with them. And remember, they're people too, even if maybe they don't seem like it because they're so far removed from you. They really are. Most of them have, you know, a home they go home to, family, you know, maybe grandkids. It's not an easy place to be either. So usually this is kind of what they're going to want to know. They're going to want to know what happened and when it happened, but in a non-technical sense. Again, think big picture. Best case, worst case, most likely scenario, and the consequences and underlying cause. Not, you know, Mr. Smith clicked this email and blah, 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 long story. They want to know a compromise occurred, which wound up essentially making data unavailable, right? You don't need to get into the nitty gritty. When you are speaking to executives, do not use geek speak. And we've already kind of covered this with the other levels too, right? You don't want to speak to them in a way that they don't relate to. And geek speak, for the most part, is going to be a no-no. So which executives? Well, make sure that all of these people at least have an idea of what's going on. So the leaders of your finance, your operations, your marketing, your technology folks. There may be others, but at a minimum, make sure that these folks are aware of what's going on. Okay, so we have given a message, and as you've seen, that message is not going to be the exact same message for all these three groups, right? But the question is, was the message received, or did it sort of fluff off, and how do we know? Well, this is kind of where nonverbal communications can come into play. If you're able to give this information to them in person, pay close attention to body language, which includes these things. So face, your posture, gestures, handshakes, breathing, all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the words coming out of your mouth. How you interpret those nonverbal cues is critical. So think about when you see somebody with raised eyebrows, right? We can interpret that with discomfort, or maybe it's surprise, or maybe it's doubt. So any one of these cues, looking at somebody excessively, crossing your arms and legs, right? Is it cold in here, or are they resistant to ideas? You can't necessarily tell. Same thing with exaggerated nodding. So what you have to do is synthesize them. Any single particular cue might throw you off. So read the person, read the situation, look at all of these things. This is just one example, right? If you have raised eyebrows with someone where their eyes are moving all over the place, their hard grip is on whatever it is, they're probably uncomfortable. but you could see something else. Again, you need to sort of look at that bigger picture. All right, and I'm flying through this. Our number one job, I have always believed in security, is to educate. We want to educate. We want people to understand why they should care about what we have to say. We don't want to adjudicate. Learn what folks know and trade back your knowledge with them. For a while, I worked with a group that were actually rocket scientists, and they were brilliant, brilliant people, some of whom were really bad with PCs. That's just not what their focus was on, but they were rocket scientists. And so I would teach them what they needed to know about their PCs and the computing and the networking that they had to do in order for them to facilitate being really good at being rocket scientists, right? Which meant using that computer as a tool. So I think it's really important to think about what you can teach others and what they can teach you. Ultimately, we want you to be the change you wish to see in the world, right? If you don't like what you see in terms of how IT and security are talking to people, then be somebody who doesn't talk that way. And that's certainly something I came up through IT doing support and system administration. That was my background before I started to do security directly. And I have found that absolutely those skills, empathy, and the things, any of the things that I've learned in any customer service role that I've had have been invaluable for me in security, in part because I'm often doing some translating of IT things to non-IT people, or even to IT people who don't necessarily grasp some of the ins and outs of all of this. And now we should have plenty of time for questions. I went a little faster through that than I was ultimately anticipating.
Yeah, so first challenge is folks are only have access to ask questions on Discord.
Discord, yep. So I'm headed there now.
Let's see what we've got going on here. Posting for questions. Questions for Catherine. So I really, there was a slide where you talked about the responsibility of management. Mm-hmm. And as a former Army officer, the thing that immediately went to my head is like, that's what leadership is, right? Like taking accountability for your organization, the people that work there. Because I think all too often we get into this blame the user culture. And to me, I simplistically look at that as we're faulting them for using a computer the way it was designed.
Yep, agreed.
And yet we continue to do it. And we hear these anecdotal stories of employees fired for failing phishing tests 3 times. And I see CISOs grab onto phishing training metrics example of progress. And they're like, we went from 27% people clicked to 22% people clicked. And I'm like, it's above 0. I mean, going back to the Bluetooth talk, and any access in is in.
Yes, and it's backwards from the way that I think people should think about those kinds of tests too, right? So I take a very strong stance on the subject of phishing. When I have a department that comes to me and says, look, we want to do this, because we offer it, but we don't necessarily do it campus-wide, I will explain to them the purpose of this is to get them better communicating about what they're seeing. The purpose isn't to catch people. Like, that's not the goal. And I think that's really important. So even the language you use, right? So you were just talking about, we went from, 25% to 22% or whatever of people who clicked. Why are we not talking about the people who didn't click? And why aren't we focusing on the message? If we want to change the behavior to a positive behavior, why are we focusing on the negative message?
Additionally, like the people that do click, and even if they are multiple clickers, those people are some of your best assets for continual training and training the people around them, not only at home, but in the work environment. Like, hey, you should double check that email. I got caught doing this. Like, that's going to be a much better trainer from peers. Additionally, from a breach standpoint, a CISO that's went through a breach or a team that's went through a breach is one of your best assets. That's training and that's hands-on experience that no one else can get or give. So those people are going to be much more effective and efficient, have a much more broad understanding of how to handle a breach properly and the communication that's going to be necessary from lessons learned. So you definitely don't want to fire them. You want to encourage that.
Yep, absolutely. Because if you can get somebody to call out, hey, this is weird looking, and then everybody else around them hears, hey, this is weird looking, hey, you should check, hey, don't click on the thing, hey, this thing just came. That is way more valuable than, well, so-and-so clicked the thing and now, we should punish them in some capacity. It should never, ever be about punishment. It should be about behavior change and moving in that direction. And again, negative behavior change is only going to happen if you continue to give a negative message, right? Like that, the two are intimately related.
Yeah, and that communication and really understanding, like us as security practitioners and InfoSec or even technical folks, we really have to understand and change our mindset of talking down to people or bringing it down to their level. That's 100% not the case. We're not business people. Our ability to speak at the level of business speak is limited to a certain capacity. So we're actually not speaking down to someone, and we have to change our mindset and say that we are taking it to their language and really understand that we're not above anybody, and that connotation of how we speak down to CISOs or executives really has to change. Otherwise, we'll never adapt. We'll never get better at speaking the business language. They'll never adapt and understand the technical language that we're bringing to them until we're both treating each other as equal and understanding and trying to make that empathy jump and make that understanding and communication jump.
Yeah, exactly. And, and maybe we need to understand a little bit more about that, the business language, right? I mean, that's something that I've had to do over time is be able to speak in that way in order to facilitate that communication. And what I think of in some ways is translation. And that's really what I spend a lot of time doing is in the awareness role that I play in my job. It really is just about saying, here's what you should understand, and here's a way for you to understand it in language that makes sense to you. It doesn't need to have all the bells and whistles and technical stuff. It needs to have the verbiage that you can relate to and you can understand.
And that applies across the board, not only from communication, but really understanding the business and the business functions and needs. At the end of the day, their business has to make money, and allowing them to make business risk decisions by appropriately bringing them the information in the language they can understand is how you properly do your job. That's your job as an analyst. That's your job as a security practitioner, is to bring it to their language so they can make an informed decision for their business. And that's something that you have to learn to apply from not only a vertical standpoint. You have to be able to talk in that industry or in that particular sect and at that level, but you have to understand their business. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to provide them the information in a means that is going to be worthwhile.
Exactly. I mean, I can give a formal example of that. I've had a couple of tickets recently where entities wanted to share data outside of the university, which is fine. Like, we do this all the time. But it was the type of data where we have to be very careful on how we set this up. So instead of either calling them up and saying no, which is what some people will simply do, or calling them up and saying, well, you have to do it this way, the first thing I did was call them up and say, what's the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? Tell me about the process that's involved here. I want to understand what you're trying to do. And then let's work together to figure out how we can most safely accomplish that. And at the end of the day, that's what we're doing. We are educating.
It's called being a good human being, right? Learning that empathy, learning to understand and communicate. At the end of the day, if we can all just be a little bit more compassionate, a little more empathetic, and really start to adapt ourselves and be the best us, that brings a whole 100% to the table, where you can have multiple 100% brought. You're going to have a much better outcome long-term in any business.
Absolutely. I would agree.
We do have some questions. First one up. What training or courses do you point cybersecurity people to help them with communication and dealing with management?
That's a really good question. I can tell you that there are a couple of people that I would look at. but I don't know that I have particular course stuff yet. I can tell you that I'm working on something myself, that once it is formally out there, I will formally announce, but I will give the hint that something is coming. But this is a tough area. There's certainly stuff out there for communication, like within businesses, and I think it's applicable, but I think it does take a little more hoop jumping maybe to see the applicability. So unfortunately, I don't have like specific things I can point people to at this time, but there's something coming.
There's a ton of books out there. Really, any of the books on understanding business leadership. I mean, look at some of Jocko's books on the dichotomy of leadership. Any of his stuff is fantastic, of really understanding how teams and dynamics work, how to take responsibility. Those all apply to the InfoSec, and being able to bring that kind of forward thinking and forward leadership to the table when you're talking with a business or an executive. I think that's a great starting point.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Okay, what do people need to tabletop first to help non-technical folks learn about what to improve?
I think with a tabletop, it's having those non-technical people at the table. Like, that's what we often don't do, right? We involve our technical people maybe in our leadership, but we don't involve those folks. So I think it's, maybe take a scenario that's already happened in your organization or one that you see frequently happening, and take a step back from the super high technical stuff and think about how you want the non-technical folks to respond to that. Like, what do you want them to do? And play that out with them. Get them involved. Have a scenario, bring one person from 5 different departments who's not technical to the table for the scenario, and see what they think. Like, get their feedback. See what they would normally do, because if what they normally would do is useful and could contribute, fantastic. If it's either a combination of things you don't want them to do or just a bunch of things you don't want them to do, then obviously that's not ideal, and you want to spend some time working within that scenario to guide them in a direction that you want them to go. So always being able to encourage positive behavior in that way can be useful.
I was impressed you had an answer on that one so fast. Because I looked at that and I was like, oh man, I feel like I'm setting her up, because that's a tough question.
It is a tough question, but I think it's an area that we're just starting to do in security ourselves, right? We're just starting to really get serious about tabletops. The backdoors and breaches, the stuff that Black Hills has come out with. Bryson, you've done these choose your own adventure scenarios, right? So all of those kinds of things are relatively recent, even though tabletopping in a general sense has been around a really long time. I've been in the fire service for a zillion years, what it seems like, and we have, they literally have tabletops with little cars and things where you can do a scenario like, you have a chlorine spill and the wind is blowing this way, and what do you do, right? So that concept has been there a really long time, but we're kind of just getting used to that, and because of that, we're only, I think, thinking about it in our security bubble at that top level, and because it's so new. But that really is kind of the next step, is legal should be involved. You should have a couple of end users. You really should ultimately have somebody from all these different levels play the game with you, because in real life they will. So if you get a better handle on what they're doing, everybody's better off, and people like doing stuff like this. I mean, my experience is it's a game for them, even if it really is mimicking like something bad that's happened in the org already. Like, it gives them a chance to kind of think about it not under that pressure, and eventually it's going to happen again.
Yeah, it also gives them a chance to kind of shine and show areas of creativity that they may not even be related to their job function. I mean, really getting people involved, getting the conversation open, and then bringing people and processes into the whole thing. Yes, there's a technology aspect. Yes, there's the mitigations and reaction, but the the processes and the people involved and being able to provide some of that benefit of walking through that, that's when you start to see huge organizational changes that can shift cultures and actually make a big difference.
Agreed.
That's why I like the Bruce Schneier quote up front about the role in technology, or the over-reliance or confidence that we have in it, and as a result shows how little we actually understand it. The major criticism that I've come up with for this industry is we have a lot of nerds coming up with nerd solutions to nerd problems.
Yep, exactly.
And that's just the technical component, which is a fraction of the problem, the surface area in these things. And we see this manifest in so many different ways. In the offensive side of the house, I think we are all too fond of being very clever. I think this is where I've been giving my talk for a couple of years now on how that's conflated with ego, starting to drive it versus still fitting with what the organizational requirements are. And we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we continue to complain that users or management or folks that are not directly within what we do don't understand what we're doing, but it's incumbent on us to speak their language and talk to them. And that's why I love the tabletops. That's why I really liked, inspired by Tim Malcolmvetter, the Choose Your Own Adventure that I pulled together, and so many other folks that are doing so many things. And I'll also give credit out to Bruce Potter for his work with his Oh No's Dungeons and Dragons style game, because those are how we facilitate that conversation. Because at the end of the day, it really isn't about the technical depth of it. You don't need to go down to Ring Zero to have a conversation over what would happen with a Ring Zero attack on your enterprise.
Right.
I don't even have to know what Ring Zero is to be able to have that conversation and having a meaningful contribution and buy-in to what your organization is doing to protect me.
Yep, and there's so much in the news right now too, right? Like people, there was a time when a lot of what we did was totally hidden. Nobody knew about any of this stuff because, you know, the whole computing thing was like under the table somehow. And now it's mainstream media. I mean, for good or for ill, right? It's out there. So people have heard the words and they've heard the way the media uses them, but they don't necessarily use the, you know, they don't understand the lingo necessarily, right? They understand the media's interpretation of it. So I think that plays a role too.
And that really is our job, is to take what is technical and provide it in a means that is actually valuable to the business. And I think we need to be the buffer between the media and a lot of our executives, because that is, you know, that is where they're having to get their source. And why are they having to get that source? We should be, as technology professionals, providing that kind of buffer and translation for them so that they can make a better informed decision that's not coming from a mass media or, you know, misinformation, disinformation, whatever you're going to call it, that's happening.
Agreed. Absolutely. Oh, we can't hear you, Bryson. There you are.
There we go. 2020, right? Like the virtual world. You got two different mute buttons. Your microphone doesn't know which is talking to what. And yes, can you hear me now? Yes, thank you.
Yes.
So, Catherine, so great to see you again, and thank you so much for this insight.
Likewise.
I thought it was a really important addition to the speaker track because I think we do not pay enough attention to the human side of these problems.
Well, I really appreciate being able to be here and talk about this subject. It's something I could talk about all day. I will be on Discord, so for any questions that didn't get answered, I'm happy to jump in and spend some time there.
Nice.
Happy GRIMMCon.
Thank you.
Thanks.